بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم رب اشرح لي صدري ويسر لي أمري واحلل عقدة من لساني يفقه قولي. Assalamu alaikum. My name is Zakia and I will be your host this evening. For the past few weeks, I'm sure all of you have had your sleeping and waking hours consumed by what is effectively the attempted annihilation of the Palestinian people. Whether that's the bombing of a hospital or babies being pulled out of the rubble. Not counting the bodies that they haven't found. That's not counting the injured who are on the verge of death and at risk of starvation, dehydration, and disease as the Zionist blockade of food, fuel, and water supplies continue. We're going to be talking about the response that we've seen from the Western leaders and their media, as well as the response from the Muslim leaders, or lack thereof, putting into perspective the wider context of the atrocities we're seeing today, inshallah. Without further ado, I'd like to introduce my co-host, Muhammad. I've got my panelists, Hanan, Shagufta, and Farhana. For years, we've seen how the media has this double standard, this bias when it comes to reporting about the Palestinians versus the Zionist entity. There was no sympathy to be seen or heard. And the double standard this time around has been particularly shocking. I'm going to quote a definition from the Oxford Dictionary, which I think is particularly important to know at this point. So the Oxford Dictionary defines propaganda as information, especially of a biased or misleading nature, used to promote a political cause or point of view. And with the ongoing attack on the Gazan people, the Western propaganda machine has come out in full force. So my first question to the panel is, what narratives have we been seeing in mainstream media, and how do we challenge them? Shagufta, I'm going to come to you first.
Jazakallah khair. With this propaganda, what we've seen is that the media have been at pains to paint a very particular picture of the reality. We've seen in the newspapers, on radio, on TV, on social media, they have demonized and dehumanized the Palestinians. They've used double standards when talking about the Palestinian resistance. They've sought to create a public opinion which condemns Palestinians, and they've tried to spread fear amongst us Muslims in the West. And if we take each of these in turn and look at them, we can see that there has been a very deliberate and concerted effort to cover the events in a particular way that we need to ask ourselves, does this give a green light to the Zionist state to proceed in the way that it has done so, to proceed with a genocide being unleashed on the people of Gaza? So we saw Netanyahu on his page on Twitter, X, say that Hamas is ISIS. And he also said this is a struggle between children of light and children of darkness, between humanity and the law of the jungle. Children, subhanAllah, children are just children. Ya Allah. The spokesperson of the IDF, Major Dinar, he said that they have butchered women and children in worse ways than ISIS. And the defense minister, Yoav Gallant, said we're fighting human animals. So with all of these statements, we saw a portrayal of Hamas as evil, barbaric, and animalistic. And it doesn't just stop there. We've all heard the story of the 40 babies that the papers said was impossible to verify, but still it was headline news over several front pages. And we saw that CNN reporter Sarah Sidner, she had to actually later apologize for being misled. And in a similar fashion, the Los Angeles Times had to redact reports they had made of rapes of women. But in both cases, we can see that it was actually too late. The damage had been done. And it wasn't just Hamas, but it was all of Gaza. And it was all Palestinians that had been demonized and dehumanized in a sickening way. And this has been continuous. It's been continuous, never ending, a relentless barrage of lies that we're hearing every single day.
So adding on from Shagufta's point, I wanted to elaborate a little more about this language that's been used, that's been weaponized, in fact, to shape the way that the Palestinian people have been viewed. They've become synonymous with words like terrorists. Naftali Bennett called Palestinian children Nazis. And I watched a UK Zionist ambassador outright denied that there is a humanitarian crisis in Gaza. There was very little pushback, if any. You won't find any of these Western leaders either coming to condemn these words. I remember learning about the Rwandan genocide. The language that was used by the Hutu militia referred to the Tutsis as cockroaches to dehumanize their own neighbors that they used to live side by side with. And the death toll was an unbelievable 800,000. Another example is the transatlantic slave trade. The enslaved were seen as subhuman. They were treated like human cargo. And even after their emancipation, they were still subjected to horrific treatment. The white community in America at that time had been so conditioned in the way that they saw the Black community that they would actually come out and watch for entertainment, Black people getting lynched and then set on fire. So Zionist propaganda against the Palestinians, we can see there are parallels where you slap on this terrorist label to justify the bombing, cutting the supply lines of basic amenities to Gaza, the water, the gas, the electricity, and so on. But the dehumanization started well before. Gaza has been living under a blockade for the past 16 years. This is a population where half of them need food assistance. They only meet 50% of the electricity. 78% of their piped water is actually unfit to drink. I mean, the list goes on, but if you actually look up as to the horrific conditions that people in Gaza are facing, it's unbelievable.
I think it was Bassem Youssef in his interview with Piers Morgan where he said, well, when you dehumanize a community, I'm paraphrasing here, but when you dehumanize a community and liken them to animals, what do you do with a cockroach when you see them? You kill them. You don't feel remorse. You don't think of them as people. It gives you wholesale to treat them like you were giving examples of, restricting their water, food, fuel supplies. How do we refute this? What do we say in the face of this sort of propaganda?
So we've got quite a lot of examples in the last sort of 80 years. If you look at them, three very main ones stand out. The first one, which is obviously quite ironic because we're basically talking about the Jewish people, was the first example of this kind of propaganda, or what we call, sometimes people call it propaganda war, is Nazi Germany in the early 40s, before the Holocaust, and during the Holocaust as well. The other very significant one to us as well is in South Africa, which spanned about 40 years. And this was really only put to rest in the early 90s. I can't believe it, but it's true because I remember it happening. I remember the release of Nelson Mandela. And obviously the last example, and probably the one that's closest to home for us, was the propaganda that they waged following 9/11, which was essentially the premise of the war on terror and the invasion of Iraq. If we go back to South Africa, it was a time when the concept of racism obviously was and discrimination on the basis of color and culture. It was something that was widely accepted. It wasn't deemed in the reprehensible way that we view it, or we hope that most people view it today. I think it probably still exists. Obviously, we know that through Black Lives Matter, but it was at a time when it was widely acceptable to have that kind of discrimination based on color. But still, there needed to be a lot of propaganda, especially later on, as there was more and more activism against what was going on, as the ANC, and which is Nelson Mandela's party, which was considered a terrorist party, just so we're clear, and he was considered a terrorist. And when he was in prison for 27 years, it was under the charge of terrorism. And so we saw that in that time, they had to deflect from the criticism that was coming towards them in South Africa. And they did that by constantly producing propaganda about how they're right to have this kind of segregation within society, their right to have this hierarchy of status, which was really, really disgusting. I mean, we're talking about, a status where the white minority were the ones that were not only in charge, were not only the ruling class, but they would have the best of everything, essentially. Obviously, this system is called the system of apartheid, and it's interesting for us now because finally it's been recognized that this Zionist entity is also an apartheid system. One of their policies resulted in the forced eviction of 3.5 million Black Africans from their homes into segregated neighborhoods. Forced eviction. When you think about this happening in the 80s, this is one of the biggest mass evictions ever recorded, we feel like we're hearing this and we're like, this is all very eerily familiar. It's because it is, obviously. We've all been following what's been going on in Palestine, what's been going on in Jerusalem. And so it is very familiar, these expansionist tactics, essentially. In fact, one of the biggest supporters of South Africa at the time was the Zionist entity.
I want to just go back to some of those points that Shugufta, you were mentioning earlier. The tactics that the propaganda uses as double standards. Tell me more about that, because I've seen quite a few.
Earlier on, I said that I felt that this is quite deliberate demonization and quite deliberate dehumanization. And the proof for this really is in the double standards that we can see if we compare media coverage now to the war in Ukraine. And if we make this comparison, we can see that again and again, the deaths of Palestinians are reported so passively that they could be attributed to natural causes and not missiles, bombing, or drone strikes. And again, we're told, that X amount of people in Gaza died, but Y number of people in Israel were killed. If we compare to the war in Ukraine, we can see that, we heard journalists speak about the Ukrainian people as European people with blue eyes and blonde hair being killed, to elicit empathy for their suffering. But on the other hand, we've heard journalists speak about the people of Gaza as the people who voted for Hamas. So somehow this justifies them being targets. We heard with the reporting from Ukraine that volunteering to fight in defense of Ukraine from a non-Ukrainian was spoken of as a heroic act. But compare it to now, if you're a British surgeon working in a hospital in Gaza, performing life-saving surgery, then it's quite possible that your family in the UK will be visited and interrogated by anti-terrorist police. We've seen sports personalities and fixtures have been only too happy to show symbols and messages of solidarity with Ukraine, but any such symbols of solidarity for Palestine are met with heavy fines, tens of thousands of pounds. We've seen again and again that the Scottish Celtic football team are fined for, there's red cards for players. The double standards are just abundant.
Yeah, absolutely. And even when you look at the Zionist whole line of defense, that the Israeli entity has the right to defend itself. This is what we're seeing time and time again. The question is, by default, does that mean then the Palestinians don't have any rights to defend themselves? And I think any sane person can see that it's based on such a false premise, because how can an occupying force play the victim and the aggressor simultaneously? I know that you guys have previously spoken about the Nakba and the massacre of over 100 men, women, and children of Deir Yassin. And again, I asked the same question, is this the right that the Zionist entity is talking about to defend itself? 2018, we heard about the Great March of Return. It lasted about 18 months. If anybody says that the Palestinian people have not attempted to peacefully negotiate with the Zionist entity, it is completely false, because this was organized by civilians and activists. There were absolutely no threat against the Zionist militia, yet they were still met with a response that was so deadly that they actually killed around 266 Palestinians. So they had snipers that were positioned who would basically open fire at protesters. And so I feel that this PR stunt that they've used, the Zionist entity's right to defend itself, shamelessly, the initial leadership in 1948, they actually believed and they would propagate this idea that as a result of the Jews of Europe going through the Holocaust, that no one will dare account them on anything that they do after that. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala tells us in Surah Al-Imran that they desire to harm you severely. Hatred has already appeared from their mouths, but what their breasts conceal is far worse. Indeed, we have made plain to you the ayat, proofs and evidences, and verses, if you understand. That's quite scary, because if this is what we see them saying, I can't even imagine what they actually conceal in their hearts. Something that I actually already mentioned, which is the policy of flyering and calling Palestinians in Gaza before they actually bomb their building. So they usually give them a minute or less than a minute to evacuate. If you fail to evacuate, then you are doing so deliberately. Then you're called participants in hostilities or voluntary human shields. I mean, there is nowhere to evacuate. This is the crux of it. There are no bomb shelters. So you are choosing between homelessness or potential death. So Palestinians who don't leave are killable. They're not even collateral because they've been warned. And so this mantra of there are no uninvolved civilians, this is what we're hearing on the news, and they are able to basically condemn outright everyone there. Just lastly, Hamas, just like all these other resistant groups that exist in Palestine, it's through the Zionist occupation and the subjugation and the massacring of the Palestinian people for the last 75 years that these resistance groups exist. There's been a lot of interviews as well where there is this question. They've been asking Muslim commentators, analysts, even comedians. They ask them, what would they deem an appropriate response from the Zionist entity over the events of 7th of October? And honestly, I was thinking we should be posing the question back to them. What would they deem an appropriate response to the atrocity spanning 75 years of brutal occupation, starting with 1948? And really the occupation goes back almost 100 years.
Can I just say, I think in my opinion, what this propaganda seeks to do is create a public opinion which condemns the Palestinians. They're all considered legitimate targets. And everything that Farhana told us about is the deliberate decision to report without any of that backstory. It's the deliberate decision to report without any context which does this. But the context is crucial. And, very few mainstream media journalists or articles mention that the Zionist state of Israel was built upon land that the Palestinian people were already living on, and that most of the inhabitants of now Gaza have actually descended from refugees who were ethnically cleansed from the southern part of this now Zionist state. So, they're not terrorists that we need to condemn, but they actually are people resisting occupation. And the media, though, not only does it not want us to know that, but it doesn't want us to dwell on it at all. Why? To create this public opinion, which condemns all of them.
We've also seen here in the UK is a campaign alongside the propaganda to silence and instill fear in anyone who voices support for the Palestinian people.
Obviously, there was already straight away, there was a response and there was aggression against Gaza. And straight away, people were taken aback by how aggressive and how many people had been killed in such a short amount of time, just in the first 24 hours or the first 48 hours after October the 7th. So there were obviously protests. There was already a lot of activism, if you like, that had upped the ante at this point. And we hear that there is now a fear of even displaying the Palestinian flag. And there was a letter by Suella Braverman, which was published, saying that, she thinks that this should be something we should outlaw, make illegal, and that it must be bordering on supporting terrorism or being at least a sympathizer of terrorism simply by waving the Palestinian flag at this point in time. And, certain things like saying Palestine will be free from the river to the sea. So there are things that have been made fearful for us to do. There was, in the first few days, there was a young teenage boy in Manchester, I think, who was actually arrested because although that letter had just been written and nothing had actually been passed, the police, a very zealous police officer, decided to take it upon himself to arrest this boy who was literally just had a Palestinian flag around his neck or around his back, and arrest him and obviously release him because there was absolutely no basis to that arrest. The idea that you can literally outlaw somebody's national flag obviously did not go down, but she tried. Very, very early on, they talked about how it would feel to be a Jewish person in London and see the Palestinian flag. Even though at that moment in time, it was the Palestinians that were being bombed, children were dying, and this is what we were seeing. That's what Muslims were seeing, not just Muslims, non-Muslims were seeing. Everyone following social media was seeing that. But all they still speak about, Michael Gove just said this apparently just a few days ago, stood outside the Houses of Parliament and said, my heart breaks at the idea that a Jewish child in London could want to have to hide their uniform so that no one will know that they're Jewish, would have to cover it with their coat or that they'd have to take their kippah off. My heart breaks. And all I was thinking, and I did actually reply, obviously, your heart breaks over this, yeah? This is 2 weeks in, almost 3,000 children and women have been killed. Your heart breaks over this, but it doesn't even hurt over these children that are being bombed and blown up to smithereens. It doesn't even hurt. Well, sorry, what is that heart? You activate that heart when there's a foreign interest involved. So yeah, there's been lots of, schools being told that we don't want to see any activism on the school grounds. We don't want you to discuss the Palestine issue. Do not be fundraising, as opposed to Ukraine, which is constantly being fundraising for. There's always a discussion in classrooms led by the teachers about Ukraine. But it all goes to lead us to fear. Thankfully, it looks like it hasn't really worked. But there are also examples of professionals in certain fields, specifically within the NHS or civil service, that have been outed as terrorist supporters just because they're vocal in their support of the Palestinian people or vocal in their support that they're against the genocide that's happening right now. So anyone who sort of dares to see the situation in a two-sided way, even forget one-sided, even two-sided way, is considered a terrorist sympathizer. If they're Muslim, they're considered a terrorist supporter. And if they're Jewish, then they're considered a self-hating Jew. And, these are the kind of things that scare people from being vocal about what's going on.
They've got an agenda. A country or a prime minister, a president doesn't put millions of dollars or pounds into their PR propaganda machine without hoping to generate a result, to generate public opinion in support of the Zionist state and against the Palestinian Muslims. And what we've also seen what that public opinion, what their agenda is in real time, because we know that the US is the biggest contributor of military aid to the Zionist state, and they donate nearly $4 billion a year. And then in this latest attack, the US has promised a further $10 billion. $10 billion to kill the Gazans, in addition to extra weapons, airships, and they've actually now also asked the Zionist state to delay the ground invasion until it can send 2,000 troops, to kill these civilians with rocks and stones. The UK Prime Minister Rishi Sunak last week visited Israel and went to see Netanyahu and said, and this was the day after Al Ahli hospital had been bombed, he says, "I'm proud to stand here with you at Israel's darkest hour. And also, we want you to win." EU President Ursula von der Leyen said last week, there's only one possible response from democratic nations like us. We stand with Israel, with the Zionist state. Now, I know we've talked a lot about the West so far, so I'd like to move on and look at the Muslim world to see what their response has been. And I'm going to hand over to my co-host, Muhammad, to talk about what exactly the Muslim world has been saying when it comes to Palestine.
What I want to focus in on now is us. As an ummah, how have we responded to this? Start with Hanan. How is it that the Muslim ummah feels about the situation?
We can see that there's been lots and lots of videos that have been coming directly from Gaza itself. And I think they're the ones that obviously affect us the most because they're telling us what they want. They're saying in Arabic, وين العرب? وين المسلمين? Where they're asking, where are the Arabs? Where are the Muslims? وين الحكام العرب? Which means where are the Arab rulers? Where are the Arab leaders? وين الحكام المسلمين? Where is the Muslim rulers? Yeah? And they're saying, why? Why are they letting us die? Why have they abandoned us? Why have they forsaken us? They're saying, we want to know that you are acting, you are speaking up, you are doing something to save us, as Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has made us, ummatun wahida. So it's like we are one ummah, and this is the ideological connection, isn't it? That Sister Yusuf, she spoke about the hadith that says that the believers, the parable of the believers in their mercy and their compassion to one another is like one body. When one limb aches, the whole body has sleeplessness and fever. And we've literally seen that, subhanAllah. We've literally not been able to sleep. I mean, most of us have not been able to sleep. At one point, I was telling my sister, I actually feel really ill. So this fever, it was real.
We've seen so many people across the world, as you're describing, Hanan, that they've taken to the streets. I mean, look at this image here. You've had Muslims rise up in Ramla, in Amman, in Aqaba, in Jordan, in Istanbul, in Ankara, in Idlib, in Syria. The Moroccan capital was rammed with protesters. You've had the Tunisian capital of Tunis, Yemen, Algeria, Egypt, Malaysia. And some of the scenes from Pakistan, there's 1 million people on the streets wanting to do something about it.
The Jordanian government, they've had to actually put checkpoints running all the way to the border. The people are calling the armies and the police there the real IDF, because not only do you protect the Zionist entity, but you also stop your own people from doing anything.
So I've seen footage of that where they're shooting at the protesters on the border. But what are the protesters saying?
They're questioning the police and the government. Are you scared? Are you scared of the Zionists? Why are you protecting them? King Abdullah came out with a statement, we're doing this to protect you. We want to protect our people. And the people are putting out on social media that you don't have the right to tell me that as a Muslim, I choose to go and stand with and fight and protect my brothers and sisters in Palestine.
Is that something you've seen as well? What's your thoughts on this?
People are sending me cartoons of the Muslim rulers giving plates of food to Palestinian children. I just thought, with the artificial borders and the boundaries that we have dividing us, they haven't even done that. They haven't even sent plates of food. The Rafah crossing between Egypt and Gaza, which actually Egypt controls, by the way, is closed.
They've unfortunately been complicit in where the Zionist entity has got to today in terms of how the land, the historic Palestine, looked before 1947, how it looked in 1948, how it looked in 1967, 76, and now. And you can see that there's an ever decreasing land that is considered Palestine, either Gaza Strip or the West Bank. And it's actually, I think, over 80% a Zionist state now. So how did that happen? They were complicit in that. This didn't happen without their support. This didn't happen without the fact that they had started to normalize relations. What does it mean to normalize relations? It means that, as I was growing up, having talked about Palestine a lot growing up, and even going back home, going to Jordan, going to Palestine, I always remembered that the neighboring countries don't recognize them. They don't accept them. The people, definitely, 100%. We're talking about the Ummah here. I was young, obviously, so that's what I took as they don't accept them. I took it from the people rather than from what was going on behind closed doors in terms of the leaders actually making deals with the Zionist state. They had already, at the time that I was young, because I was born in 1979, already started normalizing relations. Actually, Egypt signed in 1979. Not long after that, 1994, Jordan, which I could never imagine. I couldn't believe it. I remember not believing it when it happened, that the people were so obviously disgusted with this. Don't forget, Jordan is almost 85% Palestinian in their origin anyway, yeah? So they've been trying to normalize these relations, which means, first of all, the first premise of normalizing relations is recognizing the state, recognizing the occupying state as a state. This is a colonial power. This is an occupier that is occupying Muslims, our brothers and sisters, and yet we recognize them, and we recognize them as they are, meaning, at the size that they have chosen to be. Over the years, we've had MBS agree to the settlements, okay them, Sisi agree to the settlements and okay them. Obviously, Saudi's deal isn't quite done, but even before that, MBS has said something along the lines of, why do the Palestinians keep complaining? This is the kind of apathy that they have to the Palestinian people, to the fact that this is Muslim land that's been stolen and Muslims that are being oppressed. That connection isn't there. It's there in the people, alhamdulillah, but it's not there in the rulers. That's what it means to normalize relations. It means that slowly, the neighboring countries are happy with you, peaceful coexistence with you. We had the Abraham Accords just 3-4 years ago, and all the other countries kind of followed suit. So we have Morocco now, Bahrain, UAE, I can't remember, there's a few more countries that have now normalized their relations with the Zionist state.
Yeah, Turkey as well. Turkey's a big one. And people have been to the UAE, they talk about how you see these Zionist products, you see the flag wherever you go, and it's very normal and it's very infuriating as well that they're doing this. This is what normalization is. But what we want to try to understand is, what do the Muslim leaders get out of it? What is in it for them to normalize relations with the Zionists? Shagufta.
I think everyone asks why. Why have they done this? And I think there's two main reasons. The first is that these Muslim rulers are still colonized, and through them, our lands are still colonized. They are obeying their colonial masters, and they're following the plans of the Western governments, the US, the UK, and the rest of Europe. And I'm going to go into that. But the other reason that I do want to just touch on, and hopefully one of the other panelists can talk about this, is the bilateral trade deals and the agreements that exist with Israel. There's just too much money involved, millions and billions of dollars. But regarding the Muslim rulers still colonized, is that when the colonial powers created the state of Israel, they had a plan. And we talked about this plan in detail in part 1 of the podcast. But what we see now from our Muslim rulers is in line with that plan that created the state of Israel in the first place. When we looked at that history and we studied what was done and how and why, we know that they wanted to make sure that once the caliphate was destroyed, it was part and parcel of their plan that the Muslim world remained divided. And this is what the Sykes-Picot Agreement was all about. When they drew those lines in the sand to separate us, and when they gave us our flags to identify with, this is what they did. They created the Zionist state of Israel to keep their control over this part of the world. And it's actually vital for their plan that they use the Muslim rulers to achieve this. There's a quote that's been going around on social media, and it reads something along the lines of how Israel has control of all the Muslim nations, but it hasn't been able to control Gaza. And there's another one saying that the Muslim leaders are the real Iron Dome for Israel. And we need to ask how. What shape and form does this take? And the answer is, the shape and form it takes is the Western plan of normalization and through trade deals. And we've seen that this is what the peace process was all about. The whole process of talks that took place for the Oslo Accords and the Camp David agreements and the two-state solution that was born out of them, that has been all about the US, the UK, and Europe pushing the Muslim rulers to recognize the state of Israel's right to exist. Because when you do that, when you give legitimacy you actually legitimize everything that preceded it. So you say yes to the Nakba of 1948, when whole villages were slaughtered and when up to 800,000 Palestinians were expelled from their land. When you normalize relations with Israel, you give a green light to all the continued land grabbing, the illegal settlements, the persecution, the killings of Palestinians that we've seen. This is really important now that we understand this. Any call for normalization accepts a return to the 1967 borders. And what that does is that accepts the right of Israel to exist on colonized land. And when the Western governments, the governments of the UK, US, Europe, when the Western governments tell their obedient slaves to normalize, this deafening, absolutely deafening silence and complete paralysis that we are seeing from our Muslim rulers. And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, He tells us about this in the Quran. He warns us, "O you who believe, obey Allah and His Messenger, and do not turn away from Him while you hear Him. And be not like those who say, we heard, but they did not hear indeed."
You mentioned the issue of trade. So I want to focus in a little bit on this because I think it's quite lucrative, isn't it, to sign a peace deal with this Zionist entity? They're going to make some money from this. Farhana, could you just shed a bit of light on this discussion?
Yeah, inshallah. So as Shagufta quite explicitly pointed out, it's always been about money. Money makes the world go around. There's a hadith of the Prophet ﷺ that I wanted to start off with, where he said that the worst evil within a man is his restless greed and his utmost cowardice. And there's no fitting description of these Muslim rulers except how the Prophet ﷺ has described here. As Shagufta pointed out, we are talking about, post-destruction of the Ottoman Caliphate after World War I, and the dividing up, the carving up of the lands, the appointing these rulers in their place to basically serve the colonial interests. So if you were to start near the beginning, we could start off with the betrayal of Sharif Hussein of Mecca. And he was instrumental in leading the Arab revolt. They've actually got a masjid in his name in Jordan. And he led this revolt against the Ottoman Caliphate. And he was rewarded with a fee of £200,000 a year until his death. And we see that the same story is now. So if you were to look at, say, Turkey and the Zionist entity have actually had trade deals going on undercover, under the table for a very, very long time. But what's happened is that the past decade, after a flotilla incident in the waters of Gaza, Turkey sort of put this sort of image up where we've they put their relationship on ice. And what we found is that in 2022, they then publicly mended their relationship. And then we see now more and more what the normalization deal actually means, what the trade deals were actually about during the last decade. We see that they have military alliance, their armies do training together, they support each other in conflict. It's all part of their trade agreements. They have trade in military gear, heavy industry like steel that's needed for weapons manufacturing. And even during the forest fire that was in 2010 in the Zionist territories, Turkey was one of the first nations to send aid to the Zionist entity, sending 2 firefighting aircraft to distinguish the fire to the fire. And this is not an exhaustive list at all. And, this is the thing. So if you look at now Egypt as well, Egypt was the first to normalize its relations in 1980. And they actually supply the Zionists with crude oil, it's energy. And they've actually been very busy 2022. The Zionist entity and Egypt, they're moving to strengthen their economy in hoping to reach $700 million in annual bilateral trade in the next 3 years. So there's a lot of, like Shagufta was saying, there's millions and billions of pounds here that are in favor of not the people. We have to be clear here. This is not for the people. So again, this is not an exhaustive list, but if you're freely trading, if you have open flight paths between these countries, if you are sharing military expertise, if you are selling military gear and weapons, what does that mean? That means that's it. These Muslim leaders are complicit in their treachery to their own people and to the Palestinians. They've been instrumental in propping up, they've been instrumental in strengthening this occupation and the treatment and the killing of Palestinians.
And they know that. That's why they say khawana. Khawana means traitors. That's part of what they're shouting. They're shouting, وين الحكام العرب وين الحكام المسلمين khawana, traitors. You've betrayed us, sold us down the river.
Because their military have been busy. They've been busy putting out fires. They've been busy fighting the Kurds. They've been busy patrolling the Zionist borders, but they can't go in.
Islam sanctions one leader, one state, one unity. We've got a huge resource bank. We've got the world's oil. We've got gas, natural gas. We've got the precious metals, resources. We've got no shortage of wealth. Why do we need the money that the Zionists are peddling into our economies? We've even got 8 million foot soldiers in comparison to 600,000 IDF soldiers. What's going on, Shagufta?
We need to ask ourselves, what's the difference between the Muslim rulers and the Western rulers? So as soon as this current situation happened a few weeks ago, we saw that the Western rulers, they actually were falling over themselves to get to Tel Aviv. Not only did they send their diplomats, but Biden and Sunak, they went themselves. And they sat with the Zionists, they strategized together, they made promises, and they've already delivered. Not just promised, but they've already delivered material and military aid. Another post that I saw going around on social media was showing how the Muslim rulers can't even get a bottle of water into Gaza. But the Western countries, in the same time frame, they've got warships. They've managed to get warships into the sea off of Gaza. And the US is currently readying 2,000 troops. These are rulers, Biden and Sunak, who've got numerous problems at home in the UK and the US, whether that's the cost of living crisis or, they both got worries, re-election worries, major re-election worries. But when it comes to Israel, when it comes to Palestine, when it comes to the Muslim world, they've shown the political will to protect their plans and their aims and their foreign policy objectives for this part of the world. And there is no way that they can allow a people to rise up from this part of the world, a people united by La ilaha illallah, a people who reject occupation, a people who reject colonization, a people who reject foreign designs over their lands, a people who have a desire for self-determination, a people who wish to choose their own political destiny. These foreign powers, they will do whatever it takes to prevent this, even if it means a genocide, which is what we're seeing now. And the Muslim rulers, ya Allah, they're not even allowed to have a plan for this part of the world. They have to follow the plans of Biden and Sunak.
That's the extent to which it's gone, isn't it? Because they have to commit a genocide because the Palestinian brothers and sisters have shown us what they're made of. So the only way they're going to silence us is by bombing senseless, which is what they've done. 6,000 bombs in the period of, 3 or 4 days in the first week. And then now you've had 12,000. Some are saying that this is the amount of explosive that is equivalent to a nuclear bomb. Hanan, as an ummah, you're from Palestine. We're no stranger to occupation. If anyone knows the history of Palestine, they know that the land of Palestine was occupied before. And the Zionists aren't the first to have occupied this land. We had it under the Crusaders. What's different this time?
So I want to talk about one amazing story we all know about Salah ad-Din Ayyubi. But before I do that, I just want to give a parallel of Salah ad-Din Ayyubi's. The most amazing thing he had was this political will, which actually Shagufta's just talked to us about, that these, Western countries, she's poignantly shown us that they've led the way and they've actually shown us the perfect example of what it looks like when there is a clear political will based on an ideology that you share. Yeah. Even when that ideology is as corrupt as capitalism, subhanallah, but our rulers today, obviously, they're devoid of political will, any political will, even corrupt ones, even corrupt political wills, as they're literally been placed there to serve and implement the plans of the West who put them there. So this wasn't always the case. We've got a beautiful history, and the story, the truly exceptional example of Salah ad-Din Ayyubi is, there's so many parallels. Looking at the parallels of today and then. At the time of Salah ad-Din Ayyubi, there was a lot of political division. Yeah, the Muslim Ummah was divided, as it is obviously today. The Khilafah in Baghdad was almost like a figurehead. It was very weak. Each area had its own independent state. Again, very much like today. Not only that, but Egypt was ruled by the Fatimid state. And the Crusaders had come. They obviously took advantage of this weakness, this division, this disunity, and had come and had occupied Palestine. And you wonder, how's this possible? How could this have happened so far away from Europe? And it's because the Muslims were divided. They had different names and different territories. There was Syria, there was in Egypt. There was so much political division between them. So after the Crusaders took them, after they occupied them, they started to trade with them. So Egypt would trade with the occupied state of Palestine, yeah? And the Syrians would trade with them. Just like we see Jordan today, just like we see Turkey does today, just like we see Egypt doing today. And we know that if these states stopped their trade, it would actually really cripple the Zionist entity, but they won't even do that. I mean, that's the least thing that they can do. You know, a lot of people have come out and said the least you can do is kick the ambassador out of the embassies out of our countries, in Kuwait, in Egypt. It wouldn't function. It would not function if they ceased trade with them. But obviously, these are treacherous Arab rulers, treacherous Muslim rulers who have no interest in weakening the Zionist state. And so the same thing was going on then. So when we talk about political division, we have that today, we had that then. Salah ad-Din Ayyubi, he was a wali at the time. He marched into Syria completely unopposed and with broad public support because he'd already unified the people. You know, the people that were marching with him were unified under the same ideological and political will. They had the same intention, which was to liberate the Muslim lands, to bring them back under the ruling of Islam. And especially, they had a particular focus on Al-Quds, which was at the time called the Kingdom of Jerusalem. Salah ad-Din then united Iraq under his authority. And this now meant that the Crusader Kingdom of Jerusalem, let's just call it that, was now surrounded. So he'd taken over Egypt, he'd taken Syria back, he'd taken Iraq. They were now surrounded, as they are now. Only difference is that they were surrounded by the same ideology, the ideology of Islam. They were unified under that ideology. Unlike now, the people are unified. I would still want to give us hope, but the leaders that we have today, all serving a completely different agenda. And he was obviously under the understanding that there's a duty to liberate Jerusalem, to liberate Al-Quds. So he showed us how to deal with disunity. He fought and removed all the rulers who refused to unite in retaking Jerusalem. And when he went into Jerusalem, he led a united force. He had the support of the Fatimid Egypt, which had now become Islamic Egypt. And all the different territories had come with him to support this liberation of Al-Aqsa. We've got a very similar situation today where we have rulers who are in complete odds with the sentiments of the Ummah. The difference is we don't have anyone willing to fight them to say you will liberate Al-Aqsa. There was no bloodshed. Unlike the Crusaders, when they took Al-Quds and the blood was literally up to their calves down the streets of Al-Quds, the people that were evicted, obviously, they were told that they could take all their stuff with them, all their belongings, nothing was stolen from them. They even were given the right to return to visit at any time because this is the Holy Land for the Christians, for the Jews. They were allowed to come. They had the right to come and visit. They had the right to even live there, not necessarily in Al-Quds itself, but live in Palestine. And so he's given us this amazing example. And we can have that again. We need that leader again. We need the leader that has that vision, that political vision of unifying the Ummah first and then liberating the Muslim lands.
You know, I was reading that he even paid the ransom of the male captives. He released 10,000 of them. His brother also paid as well. And he didn't just let them go and leave Jerusalem. He gave them an escort so they would be protected, which is what the purpose of an army is, to protect the people, actually. This is an ayah in the Quran in Surah Ar-Ra'd, where Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, he says that he sent down water from the heavens. So the canals flowed according to their capacity, and the flood carried bulging scum. And a similar scum comes up from what they melt in the fire to obtain ornaments or other objects. This is how Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala depicts the truth and the untruth. As for scum, it goes to be thrown away, while that which benefits the people remains on the earth. And this is how Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala brings out the parables. What a beautiful parable that is, to give us some hope and some inspiration with regards to, you know, we are the upholders of truth, we are the upholders of haqq. And no matter how much they try to silence us, and there's this haqq versus the batil, the truth versus the falsehood, the truth will always prevail, subhanAllah.